Hi everybody, Eric Posa here with Copeland Technology Solutions. We help small to medium businesses leverage technology to improve their business in some way. With me today is Dave Newell. Dave started two companies on the cybersecurity side, Low Key Software and Lopter. Would you like to say hi?
Good to meet you.
All right, great. The purpose for our discussion today, we have had a lot of people talk to us about what is this New York State SHIELD Act that we hear about. You're probably getting lots of webinar requests and all of that. We figured it would be a good idea to sit down, the two of us, or stand up in this case, and talk to you about what it could mean for your small, medium business or large business. So with that being said, let's jump right in. We got some talking points on the board here. First thing, very important up at the top, is that date. Date being 3/21 this year, very close coming up. Dave, that date is coming up, but first let's talk about what is this New York State SHIELD Act that we're talking about here today. If you can summarize it as best you can, knowing it's a very big document that we have to read, what would you say it is?
Sure. So the SHIELD Act is a follow-on to a law that's been on the books in New York State for a few years, and that's a law that covers breach notification. And what happened was New York State recognized that while they had a law that required companies to report breaches if they happened, they didn't really have a law that required companies to actually protect the data of New York State residents. So the SHIELD Act is a modification to the breach notification law. What it does is it requires organizations in New York State to take reasonable steps to protect the data of New York State residents.
Great. Outstanding, outstanding. So, so you're saying it's a law to protect against New York's the use of or unprotected use of data for New York State residents. I guess who is affected by this mandate? Is it specifically companies in the finance world? Is it construction? Is it manufacturing? I guess is it everybody? Some people? And what if you do business in different states as well?
Right. So, it's a good question. And if you look at it, the key thing here is that the SHIELD Act, excuse me, key thing is that the SHIELD Act covers every organization that has information about New York State residents. So it could actually cover companies outside of New York. It's not just New York State companies, but the idea is to protect New York State residents. So when you think about it, it can cover just about everybody in New York State. In fact, I doubt that there is a company, an organization, a nonprofit in New York State that that doesn't have to comply with the SHIELD Act. And so an example actually in an industry you didn't mention is healthcare. So healthcare organizations already have to comply with HIPAA, but the SHIELD Act comes along and adds new requirements. So now organizations who maybe have been doing some HIPAA things, but maybe aren't sure what they're doing from a security perspective, really need to revisit their security and think about whether the SHIELD Act requires them to do more. Beyond that, I mentioned nonprofits. Nonprofits have to comply. Even a company that doesn't work with New York State residents, so if they're business to business, because companies have New York State residents as an employees, they have an obligation to protect that data. So the SHIELD Act applies to them as well.
You mentioned one very important thing here is that we all experience situations where we're like, oh, what governs our business? What regulations do we fall under? And while we may be compliant with one act or one mandate, this is supplemental to that. It's not taking the place of something, it's adding extra constraints to what we have to do. So like you mentioned with the HIPAA. So that's important to know that while you're under some other regulation and you're compliant, you still have to pay attention to this. You can't just assume, well, I'm good with HIPAA. This one I'm fine with.
Right.
Is that correct?
Yeah, and if you think about New York State, a lot of us have already had a lot of regulations that they had to address. And like an example is HIPAA. So if you deal with healthcare, then HIPAA is an obvious thing that you have to comply with. But a lot of law firms, accounting firms, businesses, IT providers like you and security consultants like us, we also have to comply with HIPAA because we deal with organizations that have healthcare data. So we already had to comply with HIPAA. And then a lot of organizations also have to comply with New York State's DFS cybersecurity regulations. And those went into effect a couple years ago. And those are really focused on financial service providers. But Other organizations like law firms have to worry about that because they work with financial service providers. So a lot of these requirements that we have reach out to the service providers of organizations that have to comply. And then there's PCI, the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard. That applies if you handle credit card data. And then the SHIELD Act comes along and just says, for all of the data that you have of New York State residents, you have to worry about this.
Yeah, gotcha. So they're all, now it's really just intertwining everything, and it's kind of spider webbing out to every single business, whether you're a large business, small business, financial business, or manufacturing, or cut lawns for a living. Everybody is affected here.
Yeah, and actually, that's one of the things that's noteworthy about the SHIELD Act is that it actually applies to all organizations regardless of size. And that's kind of a little bit different from what happened with New York State's DFS cybersecurity requirements. The DFS is the Department of Financial Services. And they put together these regulations that require financial services organizations to comply with a set of security requirements. And they're similar, actually, in a lot of ways to the SHIELD Act. But the difference is with the DFS requirements, smaller organizations could get exemptions from some of the requirements. For the SHIELD Act, everything in the SHIELD Act really applies to all organizations. Now, the language is that small organizations have to do things that are reasonable and appropriate. But when you look at the language of the SHIELD Act, everything that they talk about as kind of this base set of requirements is actually reasonable and appropriate for any organization. So there really isn't a lot of room for an organization to say, we're small, we don't have to do anything. You're going to have to do something to comply with this, with the SHIELD Act.
So with the DFS mandate, if you were a certain size revenue or a certain size employee, you may not have to abide by certain pieces of that, or you'd be exempt from those pieces. Where this is like, this is the stuff you got to do. You know, it's time to start paying attention to it.
Yeah, that's right.
Understood. So great. That worked right into the next section, which was who is affected by this. So we did cover that. It's pretty much every business that does work with any New York State resident data. If you house it, touch it, whatever, you have to pay attention to that, big or small. So I guess with this date quickly approaching of 3/21/2020, there's two parts to this next question. Is what if you're not compliant by this date, or what if you're not compliant altogether? I know it's a two-part question, so let's start with I think, in my opinion, the more straightforward one. It may not be, because cybersecurity is totally different. What if we're not compliant at all? What are the ramifications? What's the risk of not being compliant at all moving forward?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the SHIELD Act is not set up with an attestation process. So if you look at the New York State DFS cyber requirements, with those requirements, DFS actually required every financial service provider to attest that they had met the requirements. And the SHIELD Act doesn't have that. So if you get to the 22nd and the 23rd, you're not going to have to tell New York State whether you comply or not. But you do have to be careful in terms of not doing anything. The penalties are set up so that if you have a breach, that's really where your exposure is. So a bad guy attacks you with a phishing attack. Somebody clicks on a link, somebody shares a credential, or a hacker gets into your network and steals information about New York State residents. That's where the penalties really kick in. And there's a set of penalties for the notification side of things. So you have a requirement from New York State to let New York State know quickly, and to let New York State residents know quickly if you've had an attack. But beyond that, the Attorney General can come in and penalize you with a civil action after a breach based on failing to comply with the SHIELD Act.
Understood. Now, what if 3/21 is quickly approaching? Everybody kind of got out of the holiday funk, and now they're full speed ahead. And now they're maybe seeing this for the first time. They may be seeing some emails and stuff from their specific industry saying you have to pay attention to this. So 3/21 hits. There's a lot of stuff to address here. Do you feel they're in a good spot if they're addressing things? 3/21 passes and they still got plans in the mix. I guess, how does that happen once that 3/21 date moves forward? If they have a strategy, is the law going to be a little more lenient with them because they're paying attention to this sort of thing?
Mm-hmm. So I think there are two ways to look at it. And one way is this, you need a plan. Mm-hmm. So yeah, you should have a plan. But what you can't do is have a plan and no action. So you really have to start with having a plan and then look at that. If you hit the deadline and on the 21st you've started to build your security program, but let's say that one of the things that you wanted to do was to put in security cameras so that you could detect somebody who had accessed your facility. And so you haven't put those in yet. Well, that's a reasonable step. You should be doing that. But if you haven't done that on the 21st and you get it in a month later, you're still doing good security. I think probably a more important thing to think about here is if you understand the SHIELD Act as a wake-up call from New York State telling you that you need to be serious about your security program, then that's what this says. What you need to do is to start taking security steps in order to be more secure.
Yeah. So to sum it up, if you look at this and you say, "Oh, this seems to be like a lot of work," we're just not going to pay attention to this. That's not a good thing to do. If you're looking at this as an opportunity to say, "Listen, we should really tighten things up." Over the next 12 months, I'm going to have specific milestones. I'm going to address this. I have it all written down with dates, and I execute on that. You can't just write them down and not execute. You're moving in the right direction here. New York State's going to look at this. Hey, these people are paying attention to what they're doing, and they're trying to because they understand you can't drop however many dollars on a new security system and then also pay someone to do documentation. And then, by the way, stop what's paying your bills to address this sort of situation. So it's very important that you understand, get a plan in place, put some times and dates associated with those, and then act on those dates.
Yeah, I think one of the things to avoid is looking at this and thinking this is a lot to do and being paralyzed.
Yeah.
If you don't take that first step, you won't move towards being more secure.
Absolutely. Yeah, you have to pay attention to this. It's best to just start getting things lined up and checking the boxes. So we talked about kind of like the strategy there. If we dive into the requirement itself, there's some key pieces and key responsibilities, whether that is part of your team, part of a cybersecurity professional, or part of your IT solutions provider. So understanding those three different components, those three parties, will help you get to that role of being compliant. Let's talk about a couple of the pieces. We have some things up here on the list. What are some main components of this act?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so one of the things that you'll see in the SHIELD Act is that it is actually set up to think about kind of administrative, technical, and physical security. So there are three different areas where you have to apply safeguards. And on the administrative side, it's thinking about things like policies and procedures, having the documentation in place to support your security program, and then also defining roles. Somebody who is responsible for security and people who are part of a security team. And that can vary depending on the size of the organization, but it's something that every organization should have. A lot of regulations, and the New York State DFS cybersecurity regulation is like this, they actually spell out that the people that make up your security team don't have to be employees. And that's one of the ways that you and I can be involved with our customers in terms of running the security program. We can actually be part of that virtual team that runs a security program. So on the administrative side, that's kind of where we are, is we're in the running the process and then doing an overall risk assessment. So evaluating the security across the organization is part of these administrative controls. On the technical side, there's actually a risk assessment piece too, evaluating application security, systems, and network security. That's a piece of what we need to do. And then beyond that, we have testing and monitoring requirements, as well as intrusion detection and response requirements. And that happens actually on the physical security side too. So for physical security, we have to do the same sort of thing. On the technical side, you're thinking about a hacker or a phisher coming in and trying to get access to your network. On the physical security side, you're thinking about somebody coming into your facility or walking into your lobby and stealing a computer. So that's just as risky to data as a hack attack. And so the SHIELD Act covers all of those. It covers administrative safeguards that you need to take, it covers technical, and it covers physical security things. So all of that is mixed in it. When we look at penetration tests and vulnerability scans, the idea here is those are ways in which we do the testing activity, and testing is specifically called out in the SHIELD Act.
Now those sound pretty scary. So can you just take us, if someone's trying to do a penetration test versus vulnerability scan, like what is that? What's involved in that?
Yeah, so We'll start with a vulnerability scan. So a vulnerability scan is a technical activity where somebody, and it could be somebody inside your organization or an IT provider or a security consultant, will use scanning software to probe your network. And they're looking for systems, applications, devices that could be used by an attacker to gain access to data. And what a vulnerability scan does is it scans that and it looks for a weakness. So sometimes what I do is I use physical security as an example. So if you think about my house and somebody comes up to my house and tries the doorknob to check and see if the door is unlocked. And a vulnerability scan is like trying that knob and realizing that the door isn't locked. I found a weakness. That's what a vulnerability scan does, is it finds weaknesses. Now, a penetration test is different. So thinking about my house, a penetration test could be, I come up, I do my vulnerability scan, I find that the door is unlocked. In the penetration test, I turn the knob, open the door, walk into the house, steal the TV, put it in my car. Then I call the owner of the house to let them know that there's a weakness in their house, right? And that's kind of the difference between a penetration test and a hack. In a hack, the guy steals your TV and you're out one TV. But in a penetration test, what we're doing is we're finding weaknesses and then testing them and exploiting them to help you to understand how a bad guy could exploit weaknesses in your security.
Absolutely. And this is something that is not a static thing. Technology continues to change every single day. So it's something where it's just like antivirus. When a new virus comes out, your system goes and says, hey, I should go updates for new virus definitions, and now you're protected against that virus. It's the same thing with all of these technologies. Your applications, Windows, and all of that, there's new holes found every single day, and this vulnerability scan checks for those, whether it's bi-weekly, monthly, yearly, whatever it is, and it's catching new things. So you have to continue this on. It's not a, hey, I did it, goodbye, I'm done with it type of thing. So we got the pen test, the risk assessment, and the vulnerability scanning piece of it. Policies, procedures, plans, I guess everyone gets scared. I don't like writing documentation. I flat out can't stand it. So this kind of stuff kind of scares me. Like, where do you even start? I mean, is it how many policies are we talking about? What does that even mean from a cybersecurity and compliance aspects?
Well, one of the things that we did when we started Loki Software was we really set out to create a product that would make it easier for small businesses to actually tackle that problem. So, excuse me. So with Virtual Security Center, what we're actually doing is making it a lot easier for organizations to create policies, procedures, the standards, that documentation of the security program, and then to do training, awareness, and perform the risk analysis, do compliance reporting. So for an organization that doesn't already have a security program in place, something like Virtual Security Center is a solution. If you don't use Virtual Security Center, the work is to figure out what your policy should be, to put together training and awareness and actually start doing it. The take that we have is it's less important for most organizations to know how to create good policies or to be able to create their own training. What's important is that you can find good policies, good training, good awareness, and start using it. So that's really the key thing, is to get this done and out of the way as quickly as possible. This is a foundational element. So once it's in place, you can get about doing the processes and keeping your organization secure.
Yeah. And part of the plans and policies and procedures, we're talking about a backup and disaster recovery plan. Your IT professional should be taking you through a process that identifies when your organization has to be up and running, how much data can you lose before you're out of business. It's an RTO, RPO plan, and that's part of this whole process. On the procedure side, what happens if there is a breach? Who do we notify? Having those steps there in case you're not available, someone else has to step in. It's clearly defined, because when those situations happen, there's emotion and people forget what to do. So having this stuff defined is very good for your organization, whether it's mandated or not. So I'm glad this is kind of in place. These are things that need to happen. So we're talking about a lot of things, probably some words that may scare people. People are probably looking at this like, oh my gosh, the dollars. Let's start talking about investment. And when we talk about investment, it's not just monetary. We're talking about time, commitment, and those things. And I was talking with Dave earlier before we got started here, and one of the things he said really resonated with me is first step is making that commitment. So I guess what kind of a commitment do you feel or do you see in something like this that the group going through this procedure, this process, has to really commit to? Like who has to commit to this? Like who's got to own this really?
Yeah, in larger organizations, one of the things that we talk about with cybersecurity is tone from the top, and it really fits for small organizations as well. One of the key things is for an organization to take ownership, and there's no really better way to do that than for the owners to take responsibility for the security program. One of the things that we see is if you can't get management, if you can't get the people that started a company to take security seriously, it's really hard to expect anybody else in the company to take security seriously as well. So one of the things that we see in organizations that are good at security is that they have a leadership team that takes responsibility for security and makes security part of what they do. And that can be as simple as having a management meeting that includes a discussion of security, having identified somebody in the organization who is the person responsible for security. And if you don't have people on your team who can do cybersecurity things, then looking at adding to that team, augmenting with folks from your IT provider or from another service provider who can actually give security expertise. So all of that is about taking ownership for the security processes.
Absolutely. We have it come up often when we have our account reviews and our 6-month check-ins and things like that, where can we just pay you to just take care of it? And it's not possible. We know all about this stuff. We obviously understand firewalls and ports and all that nerdy stuff. We get it. But this stuff is a commitment by your team. We can put plenty of systems in places. We can add MFA. We can do all these things. But the biggest target is your user base, and it's your people. That's the biggest vulnerability of your organization, is the commitment by your people. So you can't just throw money at this thing. It's just not going to go away. You have to commit to it. It's a hard thing to do. You got to do it. So we're talking about, we talk about time, ownership of your entire team, investment standpoint. Someone comes up to you and says, oh my God, look at this whole thing I have to do. I'm looking at hundreds of thousands of dollars. Is it really that much money to get something, to at least start pecking stuff off the list?
Right. I mean, there are things that you can do that don't cost you anything. But really, for small organizations, I think you should probably be looking at hundreds to thousands of dollars, in terms of the investment. So if, as a small business, and you and I both have small businesses as well, so we're in the same mix. When you think about the things that we do as a small business to keep ourselves secure, it's really, again, it's hundreds and thousands of dollars. But one of the things to think about as an organization is, do you have a budget for security? That's really what happens with a lot of folks, is they're actually dealing with a budget of zero. They've never really thought about how much they spend on security. That's one of the things that you should be doing, is looking at your overall budget and categorizing it. Now, what you'll find is that there are things that you do as part of your facilities or as part of technology that are actually security spend. But what you should do is think about that. As you do, you'll see that you are spending some money, and most of us aren't starting from scratch. Most of us are doing good security things. We have antivirus, we have a firewall, we may have access controls for our facilities. It's just kind of those gaps. It's that sometimes we're not doing things as well as we could. And when we're talking about the SHIELD Act, but when you think about why we're doing security, it's not really because we want to comply with New York State. It's because we want to protect the information that we have. In this case, New York State is asking us, they're actually telling us to protect New York State resident information. But we should want to do that anyway. And we have information about our businesses. We have payment information. We have New York State and other customer information. All of this information that all of us have as businesses. Really think about nonprofits as an example. Nonprofits have important information too. They have an important service mission, and typically they're dealing with people. And because of that, they have this information about folks that they need to protect. We all need to protect information. When we think about the SHIELD Act, again, I said this before, but we should be thinking about the SHIELD Act as the wake-up call that causes us to actually make the investment to keep ourselves secure.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That's a great way to sum it up. And when we say hundreds of thousands of dollars, I mean, that if you had an unlimited budget, you could throw hundreds of thousands of dollars at this. You may be doing some stuff already, but it's not something that's, you're jumping into the deep end right away. I mean, a pen test could be between, $1,000 or it can be $5,000, or it all depends on the size and complexity of your organization. But these are things that you have to, like Dave said, start budgeting for. You have this is a line item that has to go in there. We don't like spending money on it. We get pen tests done as well. And it's something, even though we're a tech company, I don't like spending money on it, but we have to do it, and we want to do it now. We want to have those checks and balances in place. A lot of people say, well, why don't, Copeland, why don't you guys get in the cybersecurity business? I think, well, number one, it's very expensive and you have to have the expertise. We understand a lot of that stuff, but we want checks and balances as part of this whole process that we're going through. Having your IT management company do checks on your IT management from a cybersecurity standpoint, that's not a good thing. It's good to have a third party come in and say, hey, your IT organization is doing this well and not doing this well. Or else, there's too many chances there for things not to get completed the way they should. So it's very important that it's part of that line item for every year that these things are in place. So looking at all the stuff that we talked about, I know there's a lot of information in the 15 or 20 minutes that we've been talking. I guess what's the next step? So Dave, if someone in your shoes is sitting there and someone reaches out to you and says, hey, what do I do here? I guess what's the next step? What would you tell them if you're having coffee with a buddy saying, hey, I heard about this New York State Act. What do I do now? What would you say the next step would be for them?
Well, there are two kinds of prospects in this case for us. And one is folks who haven't done anything in their security program, or haven't done anything formal with their security program. And then there are those who haven't. And we actually like organizations that really haven't done anything formal in their security program. And the reason is they don't have any mistakes that we have to unwind. So we love to meet people who just want to create a good security program, because then we can come in and focus on creating that great security program just from the get-go. Yeah. Now, again, that doesn't mean that we're not going to find folks who have firewalls. I mean, even somebody who doesn't have a good formal security program, and here I mean policies, procedures, training and awareness, that risk analysis activity. Even in those cases, most of us have anti-malware, we've got a firewall in place, we're doing some basic security things. And the key for us is sometimes what we find, and you may experience this as well, is you're working with somebody and encouraging them to do security, but it's easy to push back security steps in order to get something else done for the business. So a lot of times what we're doing, and I think this probably aligns with the kind of things that you encourage folks to do, is to get security to the forefront and to do it before it's an issue rather than responding to issues later. So, a thing that happens for us is when we come in and work with an organization, one piece is it's a lot easier for us to work with folks who actually haven't built their infrastructure, because we can just go ahead and get that in place. But then the other thing that really is important for us is finding somebody who is willing to work with us. That's kind of the ownership piece. Yeah. That's where we look at a lot of small organizations are using somebody like Copeland to take care of IT. And so what we need is somebody who can work with us and will be a partner. So when you think about security, it's really a partnership between us as cybersecurity experts, an IT provider who can help to implement technology securely, and an organization that can do their part to be serious about security and take the right steps to get everything done.
So it seems like that, to summarize from what I'm hearing you say, is that first step is acknowledgement. Acknowledgement something has to be done. So I'm a small business, I'm a medium-sized business. I have to acknowledge the fact that this has to happen. I can be proactive and start implementing these things over time, or I can just let it go, and just like a server hard drive that fails, one day we have a problem. Right. So I think reaching out to Dave or myself with any questions, obviously we'll be able to help you any way we can. Acknowledge that situation, that you have to start taking cybersecurity very seriously. Educate yourself. and find out more and start taking some action. I thank you everybody for joining us today. Dave, thank you very much for making the trip from East Aurora to come talk with us. We'll be providing more content on our website, blogs, and things like that in the future. And if you have any questions, again, Dave Newell from Lopter and Low Key Software and Eric Poza from Copeland Technology Solutions, reach out to us with any questions and we'll help you the best we can.